In this lecture, we're going to consider the meaning of the phrase works of the law, which is a very central issue in interpreting the book of Galatians. When reading the book of Galatians, it's noteworthy that when referring to the law, Paul often uses the phrase works of the law. Okay? And we see this in a number of places. I'm going to read from Galatians 2:16 to give you an example. However, we know that a person isn't made righteous by the works of the law, but rather by faith in Jesus Christ. We ourselves believe in Christ Jesus, so that we ourselves believed in Christ Jesus, so that we could be made righteous by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law, because no one will be made righteous by the works of the law. So what does Paul mean by this phrase, the works of the law? We're going to look at a number of different interpretations. One that is the traditional interpretation. We are going to look at then what is known as the new perspective on Galatians and the works of the law. And then we're going to look at perhaps a mediating position. In the traditional interpretation of this phrase, works of the law, it is generally understood that works of the law should be equated with righteous conduct. All right? This is the interpretation that was generally proposed by Martin Luther during the Reformation, and the way in which the text has been read by most Protestants since that time. It perceives Judaism as a legalistic religion in which one earns justification. That would be right standing before God, or being declared righteous before God. This word is also somewhat of a theologically loaded word, through righteous conduct. And the argument is Paul was responding to Jewish Christians advocating that one must earn justification through righteous conduct, i.e. by following the words of the law. So Paul is rejecting salvation based on human merit and advocates salvation by grace alone through faith. Okay? That's so far the traditional interpretation. Now, the traditional interpretation has been demonstrated to have a lot of problems. One of the major problems is that Judaism was not a legalistic religion. Judaism was ultimately a religion grounded in the grace of God. That Judaism was based on a covenant, and that covenant, all Jews would have perceived that covenant to be a covenant established by God's grace. The law was given as a way of maintaining the covenant, or a way of facilitating the covenant. It was a response to the gracious covenant that God had given. And this idea, this clarification that Judaism is not a legalistic religion, and never was a legalistic religion, is a result of work by E.P. Sanders, and a groundbreaking book on Paul and Judaism. And he coins the term covenantal nomism. Nomos being the Greek word that means law. And so what he is saying here is Judaism was a religion grounded in a grace-based or grace-established covenant by God, and facilitated by nomism, facilitated by nomos, the law. And that facilitated the way in which Israel responded to God. But their following the law was a response to grace. It was not an attempt to earn their salvation. All right? So this is one of the problems with the traditional interpretation, which says Paul is responding to a desire within Judaism and these Christian Jews exhibiting the desire to earn one's salvation. This simply misses or misunderstands what Judaism was all about. Another problem: the laws Paul seems concerned with have little to do with righteous conduct. Paul is not talking about righteous conduct here, but more about Jewish cultural identity, or realities or laws that establish this cultural identity. So he's talking about circumcision. Remember, it's circumcision that these Judaizers want these Galatians to perform. They must first become Jews to participate in the new covenant. Or food laws, or Sabbath observance, all right? It seems to be these cultural identity markers that in Galatians, that seems to really be the crux of the issue. And also, Paul advocates righteous conduct in Galatians. Look at Galatians 5:13 through 22. It's obvious that Paul desires the Galatians to live righteously, that righteous conduct is essential for Paul. And so to argue that Paul is in some way contrasting righteous conduct with faith doesn't make a lot of sense. And earning salvation is not really an issue here. Rather, identity as God's people is at stake. Okay? So whether you're a part of God's people and what God's people look like and what you have to do to be a part of that people or have right standing to be justified, by the way, to be justified as standing in that people of God, that's what's at stake. So we have a lot of Protestants have a real misconception about Judaism. They have a real misconception about what Paul is saying about Judaism, and we need to offer some clarification here. So the traditional interpretation has a number of problems, but if the traditional interpretation is wrong, what is Paul really saying? We'll look at a new perspective on Paul and the law. The new perspective on Paul, and then specifically here on the works of the law, it finds its origins in the work of E.P. Sanders, but it is popularized by scholars like James Dunn and Tom Wright. Okay? Here the works of the law equal social barriers or identity markers, things that are distinguishing or separating Jews from Gentiles. Okay? So Paul, according to James Dunn and Tom Wright, Paul is concerned with division that's existing between Jews and Gentiles, and that's being created by these identity markers. Circumcision is keeping these two apart. Food laws are keeping these two apart, etc. So works of the law only refer to social identity markers that separate Jews from Gentiles: circumcision, Sabbath observance, and food laws. This is the new interpretation of what works of the law means. So Paul is against the restriction of grace to a particular social or cultural identity. Paul is against the Judaizers, the opponents that he's responding to, saying, hey, the Jewish Messiah was for the Jews, and all can participate as long as they're willing to become Jews. Paul sees this as limiting or restricting the grace of God to a particular social identity, okay, or cultural identity, and he is against this. This is the new perspective. And so it would be arguing that the book of Galatians is Paul's response to this narrowing of God's grace. Now, there are certainly pros to the new perspective. It's consistent with Judaism as a grace-based religion, and the evidence that supports Judaism was a religion of covenantal nomism. It recognizes that the central issue for the Galatian church is not righteous conduct, but markers of Judaism found in the law, particularly circumcision. So it pays attention to exactly the specific issues Galatians seems to be responding to. It's consistent with Paul's emphasis on righteous conduct later in Galatians, because it is not saying that righteous conduct is unimportant. It's not. The new perspective says that the issues are these identity markers, and Paul would never reject righteous conduct as important for the believer. So it's consistent with that. And it's consistent with the issue of identity as God's people being central in the book of Galatians. So central to the book of Galatians is not earning one's salvation, but central to the book of Galatians is one's identity as a part of God's people, as a part of the new covenant people, as a part of the new creation people. It's consistent with that. But the new perspective is not without its problems. There are a number of cons we'll note here to this new perspective. It does not account for what appears to be Paul's more radical rejection of the law and his teaching on the limited purpose of the law that we'll see later in the book of Galatians, where Paul seems to suggest that the entire law is a bygone reality, that it is no longer relevant. The new perspective, which sees the works of the law only dealing with certain aspects of the law, seems to not account for this type of text in Paul. It also does not account for passages where Paul seems to reject human effort or earning salvation. So there are some passages in Paul which reject this the ability of humans to effort or earn their salvation, and the new perspective doesn't account for these very well. It also conflicts with statements that suggest the law, that following the law includes following the entire law. Okay? Example, Galatians 3:10. So there are some ways in which the new perspective doesn't fit perfectly. All right? There are some. So I would suggest the new perspective is added a very good perspective on Paul and provided an important corrective to what I think is a misguided traditional interpretation, but it still has its weaknesses. I would like to suggest a mediating perspective, and this is that the works of the law refers to the entire Torah, but not to righteous conduct. What it is saying is it refers to the unique expression of moral conduct specifically found in the Torah. And what this would suggest is that the Torah is not the full or complete expression of moral conduct, or divine will for moral conduct. It is a limited or incomplete expression. And so when Paul talks about the law, he is talking about that entity which governed Judaism and the covenant of the Jews from the time of Moses till the time of Christ. So he is talking about a particular entity. He's talking about everything we find in the Torah, but he is talking about it, he's not referring to all righteous conduct. He's not referring to things that might go beyond the Torah. This would be seeing the Torah as a limited expression of righteous or expression of God's desire for righteous conduct. Now, this position is consistent with the specific situation in the Galatian churches regarding circumcision. It says, because that limited expression of God's will promoted circumcision, so it is consistent with the focus on circumcision we see in Galatians. It's also consistent with Paul's critique of the law in general, where Paul seems to be arguing the law is a limited reality. And this makes sense if Paul's saying the Torah, the law, is limited, but not saying moral conduct is limited. What Paul is saying is there is an expression of moral conduct that governed for a while, but now there is a new expression of moral conduct, and it might overlap with the law. There might be similarities between the two, but it should not be equated with the law. We'll get into this more as we're getting into the book of Galatians and we look more closely at the law in Galatians chapter 3. It's also consistent with Paul's affirmation of righteous conduct elsewhere. Okay? So what I'm essentially saying is Paul is rejecting the Torah proper, the law proper that was given to Moses and governed Israelite life. He's saying that entity no longer necessary. Okay? But that doesn't mean Paul is saying moral conduct is no longer necessary. He is saying moral conduct as described in the law no longer necessary. So what then is Paul rejecting, and what is Paul advocating? I would say Paul is saying the works of the law are neither necessary for entrance into God's people, and I think we should understand entrance in God's people or participation in God's people is what justification is talking about. It is talking about right standing in the people of God. So one does not need the works of the law for that right standing, or they do not need the works of the law for facilitating the new covenant between God and God's people. Right? For Paul is going to argue that faith is the means of justification, i.e. entrance into the people of God. So these Gentiles don't need to become Jews. They don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to follow Sabbath, observe the Sabbath. They don't need to observe food laws. They, simply by faith, are able to enter in and be justified and stand rightly in the people of God. Now, let me stress here and discuss faith. Faith is a word that, in Greek, there is a verbal form of the word. All right? The word pisteuo is a verbal form of the word pistis. And so it means something like... well, let's say this. In English, we do not have a verbal form of the word faith. Faithing is not a word. One cannot faith something. And so in English, we translate the word faith into belief. The problem with this is it misses the point of Paul, and it confuses the English reader. And I think too many English readers associate faith simply with belief because that word is often translated as belief in the New Testament. And so when it says something like Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, or he was justified by what he believed, we mishear what Paul is saying, and we tend to conclude that we are justified, or that Paul is saying we are justified or in the people of God simply by what we mentally believe, what we mentally assent to is true. And this is not what Paul is saying. Faith for Paul, both as a noun form and a verb form, is not just mental assent to particular truths. Faith for Paul, or faithing for Paul, has to do with fully entrusting oneself to God. Faith for Paul would imply righteous conduct. Faith for Paul would imply obeying God. Paul could never conceive of a faith in God that did not also obey God. All right? So this is the problem. Too often we have, based on the old traditional view of what works of the law are, we have divided or put a huge wedge between faith and between righteous conduct, or what we might call righteous works. And this is never Paul's intention. Paul's intention is not to divide faith and works. Paul's contrast is between faith and the works of the Torah, the works of the law, but never between faith and righteous conduct. For Paul, faithing in God involves righteous conduct. You cannot separate those two realities. So the Gentiles, by entrusting themselves to God, and by obeying God and living by the Spirit of God, are justified and a part of the people of God. All right? It's not by following the Torah that they're part of the people of God. That's so important to understand. And then Paul would say the Spirit is the Spirit of God, and we'll see this more clear when we get to chapter 5, but the Spirit of God is the means of facilitating the new covenant. There is now a new covenant between God and his new people. All right? And the Spirit facilitates the way in which that new covenant people are to live. The Spirit determines how the Spirit of God, or how the people of God live, and empowers them to live that way. And so for Paul, and Paul I think would always say that entrance into the people of God was always by faith. Abraham enters by faith, but now the way the covenant is facilitated changes. The covenant is now not covenantal nomism, which is covenant ran or facilitated by the law, but now it's covenantal pneumism. Now it's covenant facilitated by the Spirit. Okay? We enter the covenant by faith, we are justified by that faith, and the covenant is facilitated by the Spirit.